Some houses aren't built from walls and rooftops. They're built from the stories no one ever dares to tell. And sometimes, a single ribbon, or a sealed diary holds the weight of a truth too heavy for time to bury. But when one woman drew her own line between justice and revenge, the real question was never who committed the crime. It was why, and more hauntingly for whom was it hidden. The morning unfolded like a secret not yet told. A delicate hush draped across the village of Elmridge Hollow as though the world itself held its breath. Dew clung like crystal to hedges. Birds offered hesitant trills as if unsure whether to break the stillness. And from within her moss-bordered garden, Eleanor Blythe moved with the graceful rhythm of solitude, her shears clicking gently as she trimmed the frost-dusted tulips. The chill in the air carried the faint scent of disturbed earth hyacinths, and something subtler like forgotten paper or old perfume. Just as she leaned toward a sleeping bud, her gaze was drawn almost magnetically to the black wrought-iron gate of Wrenmore House across the lane, its rusting bars veiled in ivy and shadow, untouched for nearly 2 decades. But now, impossibly, there was something new, a ribbon, pale blue and aged to a ghostly softness, tied in a deliberate bow to the gate, fluttering faintly in the stillness, as if whispering an old name. There was nothing festive about it, no child's play or decorative whim. It had the stillness of intention. Eleanor's breath stilled. She hadn't seen that shade of ribbon in 19 years, not since the evening Lillian Ashcroft vanished, leaving behind only her sketchpad, her voice lost to the woods, and a village full of questions no one dared repeat aloud. The ribbon was identical, worn silk, frayed edges, a single strand of silver thread barely visible along the trim. Eleanor stepped toward it, her boots crunching frost, and with each step, memories pressed closer. Lillian's haunting sketches, her sudden laughter, the way she spoke of shadows as if they had personalities. The girl had been unlike anyone, precocious, gifted, troubling. Some said she heard voices, others that she saw things not meant to be seen. She disappeared on a rain-slicked evening, claiming she was following something she'd drawn but hadn't understood. All that remained was a half-finished sketch found in the woods, a figure with no face standing at the threshold of a gate. The village had searched with torches, dogs, and trembling hearts, but she had vanished like smoke in a storm. Wrenmore House, where she once lived, had fallen into eerie decay. Its windows stayed shut, its halls silent, its garden choked with ivy and thorn, as if the house itself grieved or remembered too much. No one dared enter. And yet now, after all these years, the ribbon had returned, tied not loosely, but with care, as if by a hand that remembered. By the time noon cast soft gold over the rooftops, the ribbon had become the heartbeat of whispered conversation. In the bakery, old Mr. Henley swore he remembered Lillian wore a ribbon just like it that final day. At the post office, Miss Fennigan declared she had once seen Lillian sketching a gate exactly like the one now bearing the ribbon, claiming it wasn't Wrenmore at all, but something older. At the apothecary, Mrs. Carrow whispered, wide-eyed, that the ribbon had been cursed, a family heirloom, sewn from a mourning veil soaked in grief. But Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched the gate, and thought about time, how it loops when not watched closely, how some doors open long after they've been locked. And then, as if the universe was answering a question no one had asked aloud, a notice appeared on the parish board. Wrenmore House, sold. The name inked beneath it in calligraphic strokes read Miss Isadora Vale. No one knew her, though she arrived the next day in a dark green motorcar polished like bone, stepping out with a presence both regal and spectral. She was tall, her posture ramrod straight, her white blonde hair pulled into a braid, coiled like a serpent at the nape of her neck. She wore gloves even indoors, spoke rarely, and turned down all invitations with an elegance that discouraged insistence. Her luggage bore foreign stamps, Marrakesh, Oslo, Thessaloniki, and the faint scent of sandalwood and old letters clung to her presence. The villagers murmured as villagers do. Was she Lillian's cousin? Her half-sister? Some swore she had Lillian's eyes, only colder. Others wondered if she was Lillian herself, returned from the grave. But Eleanor, ever watchful, waited. That night, beneath a low moon, she retrieved an old box from beneath her bed, hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a sketchbook, one she had kept hidden since the day Lillian vanished. On the last page, dated in faded pencil, was a gate swallowed in ivy and a house veiled in shadow, and tied to the gate, delicately shaded in a single stroke of blue graphite, was a ribbon. It was the same scene she had stood before that very morning. Eleanor felt it deep in her chest, not memory but warning. Something had returned to Elmridge Hollow, and this time, it wanted to be found. The morning had broken in a silence that felt almost curated, as though the village itself held its breath in anticipation of something long overdue. Miss Elowyn Hartley, bearing a modest almond cake wrapped in floral linen and the quiet resolve of courtesy, made her way along the ivy-curtained lane toward Gracemere Hollow, the old Thorn property now occupied once more after 15 silent years. She walked with a purposeful grace, a woman of habits and hunches, of floral teas and precise observations. The new tenant, a widow by the name of Lucinda Crane, had arrived quietly under a grey sky, her presence marked only by the slow creak of furniture being unloaded, and the faint scent of myrrh trailing from open windows. Elowyn's knock was met with a moment's pause too long, followed by the careful unlatching of the door, and a measured welcome that held neither warmth nor offense. Mrs. Crane stood like a portrait from a forgotten era, tall, composed, dressed in muted navy, her gloved hands never quite still, and her smile as carefully constructed as the lace at her collar. She received the cake with gratitude, yet something about her manner was cloaked in a caution not easily explained, as if she expected every kindness to come with a cost. The drawing-room was sparsely furnished but curiously curated. An oil painting above the hearth instantly drew Elowyn's gaze. A girl in profile, her auburn hair gathered with a green velvet ribbon. The face had been violently scraped out, leaving behind angry grooves in the canvas, as though someone had tried to erase not a likeness but a memory. Elowyn did not remark on it. Instead she engaged in light conversation. Weather, garden soil, the charm of early crocuses. But beneath the surface of words, a weight lingered in the air, a stiffness that no amount of politeness could lift. Mrs. Crane volunteered little, her answers wrapped in precision and finality, and when asked, almost incidentally, whether she had any family nearby, her none whatsoever came swiftly too smoothly rehearsed. Elowyn left with a gracious nod and a mind uneasy. As she stepped onto the gravel path once more, she instinctively turned to glance back at the gate and froze. The green velvet ribbon which had been fluttering on the iron latch earlier that morning was gone. Its absence, she thought, throbbed louder than its presence ever had. The following day, as Elowyn sat beside her sunlit parlor window, threading lavender floss through linen, her fingers brushed against a folded slip of paper tucked impossibly deep within her needle basket, a basket she had not moved in days. The paper was tissue-thin, the ink slightly smudged, the cursive slanted and elegant. Find the girl with the ribbon, she never truly left. No name, no date, only the faint scent of rosewater, haunting in its delicacy. Elowyn's eyes lingered on the note for a long time, the phrase curling through her thoughts like fog creeping over a moor. She never truly left. It wasn't just poetic, it was a claim, a conviction. Someone believed the girl, whoever she was still there in Gracemere Hollow, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but truly there. Elowyn rose without haste, placing the note beside the mantel clock that had not ticked in years. Her breath caught slightly as her mind began assembling fragments, rumors long buried, stories half whispered over tea, and the peculiar case of a child, Lottie Thorne, who had vanished from that very property 15 years ago, just before the family fled the country under curious pretenses. The painting's missing face, the reappearance of the same green ribbon said to have been part of the girl's favorite Sunday dress, and now, the arrival of a widow, whose past, despite her eloquence, hung about her like mist, undefinable and impenetrable. Elowyn had always believed that the loudest truths were often drowned by the quietest lies, and someone, it seemed, had finally decided she was the one meant to listen. But why now, and who had placed the note so intimately within her things without leaving a trace? One did not disturb Eloin's needlework lightly. There was purpose in the act, and perhaps danger too. She knew one thing for certain: the mystery of the ribboned girl had not ended 15 years ago. It had simply waited for silence, for memory to settle like dust, and for someone like her, patient and precise, to begin unraveling the truth that had been stitched far too tightly into the seams of Gracemere Hollow. The whispers had already begun to coil through the cobbled lanes of Elmridge Hollow by the time Evelyn Harrow arrived with her lacquered suitcase and air of tired elegance, claiming the long-abandoned Greystone Manor as her own. To most, she was simply a widow returned to familiar ground, seeking solitude amidst the hedgerows and honeysuckle. But to those who remembered the manor's last occupant, a girl named Lisbeth Holloway, who had vanished one storm-lashed spring, and was never seen again, Evelyn's presence stirred the stagnant air of the village like a spoon through long-settled dust. It wasn't merely the timing, oddly close to the date Lisbeth disappeared, nor the fact that Evelyn bore an unsettling resemblance to the Holloways in her profile, in the distinct curve of her jaw, and the pallor of her skin, but the way she moved through the world with such eerie stillness, as if listening for sounds no one else could hear. Even the house seemed to lean inward as she passed, as though it too recognized her. Eleanor Tibbet, who kept meticulous notes on village comings and goings under the guise of knitting patterns, noted that Evelyn never walked through the grocer's door, but always sent for goods via a silent boy who never looked up. Mr. Kettle, the vicar, mentioned in a hushed aside that the organ now emitted a faint echo on its own at dusk, and that Evelyn was often seen lingering near the graves, her lips moving without sound. But it was young Meg Parsons, barely 17 and brimming with morbid curiosity, who dared venture closest, claiming she'd seen Evelyn in the attic window, speaking softly to someone who could not be seen, a candle trembling beside her hand as though caught in breath not her own. The matter escalated from murmurs to full-blown fascination when Miss Adelia Stone, keeper of the village's obscure folklore and owner of the only working phonograph, unearthed a diary page believed to be Lisbeth's, torn, water-stained, but legible in parts. "She comes with the scent of violets. Her voice walks ahead of her. I think she lives in mirrors." This entry, read aloud over tea at the bookshop's weekly circle, caused several women to cross themselves, and one to excuse herself in tears. Yet Evelyn remained undisturbed, serene in her silences, though Miss Cranwell, the postmistress, swore she once saw her eyes dart to the mirror behind the counter, not with vanity, but dread. Days later, as a storm gathered with unnatural urgency, Miss Cranwell herself delivered a parcel addressed in delicate script to Greystone Manor, only to find the door ajar, and the interior oddly cold, as though the fire had been extinguished for hours. A single voice, childlike, echoing, rose from upstairs, calling a name that was not Evelyn's. When she returned to the village, pale and shaking, she spoke only once. "There are 2 women in that house, but only one casts a shadow." It was then Miss Adelaide Harlow, ever practical yet deeply perceptive, took it upon herself to pay a visit, arriving with no pretense, just a jar of black currant preserves, and a smile that had soothed many troubled hearts. Evelyn greeted her kindly, offered tea, and spoke of lilacs and aging stairwells. Yet Adelaide noticed that no mirror in the house faced outward, all covered, turned, or removed entirely. As she left, Evelyn pressed into her hand a thin envelope without a word. Inside, scrawled in ink that had long since faded, was a single line: "The girl is still here, she never stopped waiting." Adelaide, who had lost a daughter long ago, felt something within her still, not fear, but recognition. And as she walked back into the darkening village, the wind carried with it a scent, not of lilacs or roses, but violets. The kind that bloomed only in the hollow places where sunlight never quite reached. The fire in Miss Ellery's hearth had long since died to embers, yet a strange scent lingered in the parlor air, not the sweet familiar traces of old wood smoke or lavender polish, but something faintly charred and unsettling, like scorched velvet or a memory set alight. The room was dim, cloaked in a hush that seemed to pulse with something unsaid, and outside, twilight folded across Elmridge Hollow like a forgotten page turned by unseen hands. From her chair near the window, Miss Ellery sat unmoving, her teacup long cooled, her gaze fixed on the ancient silhouette of Hollowmere House across the fields, once lifeless, now breathing again in fits and starts. A candle glimmered behind the attic's warped glass, its flicker steady as a heartbeat or perhaps a warning. That house had stood empty for nearly 40 years, its shutters nailed tight, and its stories sealed even tighter, until a fortnight ago, when a Miss Thalia Ralston appeared as suddenly as mist on the moor, claiming the deed without ceremony, and arriving with a single battered trunk, a box of aged books, and a portrait swaddled in burlap. No one in the village had seen what lay beneath that cloth, but whispers began the moment the front door creaked open. She was graceful but spectral, her accent not quite local, her habits nocturnal and peculiar. Miss Beecham, the retired schoolmaster with a suspicious ear, swore her voice carried a cadence he last heard in Geneva, while Mrs. Cotterill was convinced the new arrival bore an uncanny resemblance to Marjorie Talbot, the vicar's daughter who disappeared one summer's day in 1908 wearing white muslin and a shy smile. That old scandal had been buried deep, like most truths in Elmridge, but with Miss Ralston's arrival, the soil had started to shift again. Then came the lantern. It appeared 3 nights after her move-in, an old iron carriage lamp, dulled by rust, its glass fractured but functional, placed exactly where Marjorie's bonnet had been discovered by the weir decades ago. No one claimed responsibility. It would glow until dawn, then vanish, only to appear again the following night in a different location, the chapel's broken step, the hollow by the ash tree, even beside the sundial in the green behind the manor. On the 4th night, Miss Ellery walked the path herself, guided by nothing but instinct and unease. The lantern was gone, but the scent of violets, Marjorie's perfume, long out of production, hung in the air like an accusation. And then there was the visit. Under the guise of returning a wrongly delivered envelope, Miss Ellery had stepped into Hollowmere House just once. It smelled of dust, mothballs and age, but something else too, fresh varnish and something faintly metallic. Miss Ralston, calm and unreadable, welcomed her with polite reserve. But above the fireplace, framed in a carved oak casing, hung the painting, a girl in a blue sash, seated beneath a tree heavy with blossom. Her face was delicate, and almost painfully familiar, but it wasn't her expression that unsettled Miss Ellery. It was the frame, and the inscription that curled in Latin across its edge. Memonisti et taciabis, you remember, and you will remain silent. The phrase lodged itself in her mind like a thorn. That very evening at the village's annual rose fete, conversations blossomed among the ladies as easily as the petals, though the undertone was far less fragrant. Miss Ralston had not attended. Again, some said she was ill, others claimed she didn't want to be seen in the daylight at all. But when old Jonas Fenn, believed drowned during the Great Flood of '29, was spotted standing just beyond the fete's boundary fence, soaked to the skin beneath a cloudless sky, staring silently at Hollowmere House, the mood shifted from idle gossip to the chilling grip of dread. He did not speak, nor blink, nor move. He simply stood, a ghost among the living. Even the birds fell silent. Miss Ellery, watching from beneath the striped awning of the tea tent, felt her breath still, not in fear, but in confirmation. Something was surfacing, something long buried beneath generations of silence, shame and unspoken knowing. She did not gasp, nor did she speak. She simply reached for the small notebook hidden in her handbag, the one she only ever opened when the past began to stir. Because in Elmridge Hollow, secrets never truly die, they wait, and whisper, and burn just long enough to be seen. And Miss Ellery, who knew the shape of truth when it curled at the edges like old paper, was ready to follow the fire. Silence had clung to the village for weeks, heavy as rain-laden clouds, but it broke the moment Elias Harrow reappeared, emerging from the path behind the chapel, as if called forth not by time, but by memory itself, just as rumors of Isadora Vale's long-forgotten letters had begun to ripple through the hedgerows like wind before a storm. Miss Penrose, seated near the lavender trellis with her notebook unopened in her lap, watched Elias with narrowed eyes as he crossed the lawn, his figure thinner, shoulders drawn taut, his step hesitant yet inevitable. He stopped short upon seeing Mrs. Castlemere, who had arrived moments earlier, and now stood beside the Reverend's widow, her voice a hush under the canopy of rustling ash leaves. Elias's gaze faltered, not out of anger or longing, but something darker, a flicker of unwelcome recognition wrapped in dread. Mrs. Castlemere did not meet his stare. Instead she turned slightly away, her gloved fingers tightening around the handle of her parasol, as though bracing against a gust of wind not yet come. Miss Penrose, ever the observer, noted how Elias refused the cordial offered to him, asking only for plain water, which he drank in slow calculated sips, his eyes drifting toward the ancient obelisk that loomed beyond the orchard, a stone relic that hadn't told time correctly in years, yet stood like a sentinel for secrets too old to name. Elias lingered there, unmoving, as the gathering buzzed around him, eyes tracing the carved runes worn down by time and moss, while his shadow merged with the sundials, as though past and present had momentarily aligned. When spoken to, he answered vaguely, with clipped phrases and sidelong glances, never toward the house he once called home, but always toward the path that led to the weeping pond, where the letters had been found, folded, damp and sealed in wax not melted by any recent fire. His fingers hovered once near his inner coat pocket before he withdrew them, not in forgetfulness, but in fear of what he might draw forth. Mrs. Castlemere approached the sundial briefly, though not directly, allowing her path to bend slightly, as if proximity alone could awaken what they had buried. Elias's shoulders stiffened, a small breath escaping him that wasn't quite a sigh, nor entirely a laugh, but a sound that belonged to grief once refused. They avoided each other with a choreography that spoke of old vows undone, and silences too fragile to shatter, a tension that did not go unnoticed by Miss Penrose, who scribbled nothing but watched everything. Later, as the sky dimmed to indigo and lanterns were lit with reluctant hands, Elias and Mrs. Castlemere were seen walking along the bramble path behind the old dovecote, shielded by the overhanging vines, just out of reach from the glow of the gathering's warmth. Their conversation, though inaudible, unfolded with subtle intensity, his posture coiled with unease, hers composed but unreadable, as though she were passing which version of the truth to offer him. When he leaned in, his voice clearly measured and urgent, she did not flinch, but met his words with a stillness that suggested not surprise, but expectation. Whatever passed between them, left no trace in her face, but Elias's hands trembled slightly as he stepped back, his eyes flickering once more to the obelisk, as though it bore witness to the reckoning he had failed to prevent. When she returned to the lawn, she spoke brightly of hydrangeas and local weather patterns to the vicar's niece, but Elias remained behind in the darkening garden, unmoving beneath the boughs, his gaze locked on the spot where the sundial's shadow now vanished into the earth, as if time itself had surrendered. And Miss Penrose, still beneath the trellis, quietly turned to the blank page in her notebook, finally ready to write, knowing now that the past was not returning, it had already arrived. By the time morning light spilled reluctantly over the hedgerows of Grenton Hollow, the garden, once a sanctuary of laughter, lace parasols, and syrup-drenched sponge cakes, had soured into something haunted, hushed and riddled with questions too unsettling for open voices. Where guests had idly strolled the rose paths only hours before, now they lingered like shadows, exchanging fragmented whispers and nervous glances toward the sundial, the very place where the gardener's boy, trembling and pale, had discovered Henry Olton's lifeless form shortly before sunrise. His body, oddly twisted and slumped, as though dropped rather than fallen, rested at the base of the aged stone, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His collar was undone, exposing a neck that bore not the bruises of accident, but the narrow even indentations of something thin and deliberate, marks too precise for clumsy hands or rope, too symmetrical to be the aftermath of a fall. Clutched in his rigid fingers was a piece of green velvet ribbon, dampened by morning dew, and darkened at its creased edges, its presence as chilling as it was inexplicable. When the constable arrived, his demeanor was quiet, almost apologetic, And the village doctor, a genial man more inclined to downplay than diagnose, muttered something forgettable about cardiac arrest brought on by heat and stress. But those who had seen Henry the afternoon before, his sharp eyes darting beneath furrowed brows, his jaw clenched as though holding back some sharp truth, spoke of no fatigue, no frailty. He had moved through the party like a man hunted by memory, not illness. Miss Denley, the reserved and observant spinster who rarely missed what others dismissed, had watched him from her usual spot beneath the wisteria, and when asked by the Reverend's wife what she thought, she had said only this: velvet doesn't bruise the neck unless it's pulled with a purpose. That quiet line echoed through the village far longer than the doctor's vague pronouncements. For some the ribbon conjured memories of youthful courtships, of May-Day dances and girlhood laughter, but to the more discerning, it was not a token of romance, it was a signature. The inquest that followed was swift, unchallenging, and faintly uncomfortable, like a conversation everyone wished to end. The coroner, who had known Henry's family for decades, spoke with gentle finality of collapse and heatstroke. There was no mention of bruising, no pursuit of motive, no questions asked about the ribbon. The constable's report, delivered in monotone, skirted inconvenient facts with the practiced vagueness of someone who had already been advised not to dig too deep. The village, with its usual preference for polite endings over complicated truths, murmured agreement, and folded the incident away like a yellowing newspaper clipping. But Miss Denley could not. She sat by her window as dusk fell again, the world tinted with lavender light, her thoughts circling like moths to a candle. She remembered Henry's expression, tight-lipped and watchful, the way he had refused tea, refused conversation, but not once took his eyes off the sundial, or Mrs. Caulfield. That woman, elegant, soft-spoken, and endlessly gracious, had glided through the garden with her usual calm, but Denley had seen something flicker in her smile whenever Henry passed. A flicker not of warmth, but of calculation. And then there was the ribbon. Henry hadn't had it during the party. That much Miss Denley was certain of. So how had it come into his possession between dusk and death? And why would a man like Henry clutch it in his final moment, unless it meant something, something damning, something personal? The bruises gnawed at her thoughts. They were faint, yes, but deliberate, not chaotic like an accident. They bore the marks of pressure, not panic, of control, not chaos. Such an instrument, a velvet ribbon, was not something a man would use, but a woman who knew how to kill without raising suspicion, how to strike where no blood would show, might see the ribbon as both message and method. And Miss Denley recalled too clearly now how Mrs. Caulfield, later that evening, had stood beside the parlor hearth with an oddly distant expression, feeding a small green item into the flames, calling it a soiled piece of an old gown. The ribbon, the same shade, the same texture. And though others in the room hadn't looked twice, Denley had. She'd watched the way Mrs. Caulfield's eyes never quite followed the smoke as it curled upward, because Denley suspected, she already knew what truth it carried with it. And in that silence, that carefully cultivated absence of evidence, Miss Denley understood what most could not. That murder in villages like Grenton Hollow did not come with screams or spectacles. It came dressed in civility, with a touch of perfume, and a velvet bow, leaving behind no scandal. Only a question, forever unanswered, and a name, slowly fading from polite conversation, but never from certain memories. There was something unnervingly ceremonial in the way the green velvet ribbon had re-emerged, not stumbled upon, not carelessly dropped, but clutched, as though even in death, Henry Lenton had something left to say. Some quiet cry of accusation that fingers alone could utter. It wasn't just a ribbon anymore, it was memory made tangible, wound tight with regret and old sin. Miss Aldrich had always mistrusted coincidences. In her world, patterns existed for a reason, and silence often screamed the loudest. She'd seen too many times how secrets never really died. They simply waited, biding their time, buried under niceties and hedges, until something, a death, a sale, a single overlooked detail, unearthed them like bones long hidden beneath a garden's surface. That ribbon, once delicate and full of promise, had aged into something more sinister, less an ornament and more an omen. If it had once fluttered in youthful defiance around Clara Darlington's slender neck, now it had returned as a noose of truth, tightening around those who thought the past had been successfully entombed. As the sun dulled behind the trees and the birdsong faded into a hush, Miss Aldrich sat unmoving in her study, her journal untouched, her thoughts running like currents beneath still water. Elmridge was a village with tidy lanes and trimmed hedges, but beneath its quiet charm ran veins of untold stories, the kind that left stains on reputations and bruises on legacies. And now, with Henry's body scarcely cold, those stories were beginning to stir. The past never slept, it merely paused. Rumors slithered back into parlors, and across church pews, sharper now, more vivid, as if morning had torn away the curtain. Mrs. Havenbrook, the once trusted governess, whispered of a quarrel that had shattered the peace on the night Clara disappeared. Voices not of discipline, but of desperation. Clara had threatened to leave, to run away with a man whose name no one dared speak aloud, though everyone felt the weight of it pressing like a ghost in the room, Henry. Her mother, Lady Darlington, had called it a disgrace too monstrous to tolerate. And then, in the early morning, she had been seen, her slippers muddy, hands covered in soil, muttering something about a missing cat no one remembered ever existing. Later, Clara's room had been found untouched, except for the absence of the one item she was never seen without, her green ribbon. Miss Aldrich didn't speak of her suspicions, not yet, but inside her mind, a quiet storm gathered. She understood that this wasn't merely a girl fleeing love, it was something darker. This was about control, about reputation, and the deadly fear of scandal. Clara hadn't vanished, Clara had been erased. There are silences that linger not from forgetfulness, but from fear, and Miss Aldrich had learned to listen to those. Weeks before the deed changed hands, and the Darlington cottage came under the name of Mrs. Winthrop, the woman had been spotted outside the estate's locked gate. She hadn't knocked, hadn't entered, she had simply stood there, as though remembering something too painful to touch. Miss Aldrich had passed her on her walk, noted the woman's posture, still, reverent, almost as though she were waiting for permission from the dead. She had rested her hand on the iron bars, not to open them, but to connect with what had been locked inside. This was not a visit, it was a return of conscience, a haunting. Knowing her instincts would not rest, Miss Aldrich paid a subtle visit to Mrs. Penfield, the dressmaker whose hands had stitched both joy and sorrow into fabric over decades. Under the guise of mending a sleeve, Miss Aldrich asked gently of the old days, and soon, with the sun falling through the lace curtains, the talk turned to the Darlington girl. "Ah yes, Mrs. Penfield," murmured, her fingers trembling over a spool of emerald thread, green velvet. "Such beautiful eyes that girl had. Her mother insisted I make 2 ribbons, said girls lose things. But she never did. Not Clara. Not until," her voice trailed off into the silence that now felt thick with implication. Miss Aldrich understood. The first ribbon had vanished the night Clara did. The second had just reappeared, in the clenched hand of a man who had no business holding it, unless he had carried a secret all these years. The question now was not how the ribbon returned. It was why now, and who was ready to be undone by the truth it carried. The ribbon was never meant to return. Identical in width, shade and stitching, yes, but only one ever came back, and the silence surrounding the other had always whispered something darker. Miss Ashcroft remembered the day the second vanished. Mrs. Penlow simply shook her head when asked, muttering something about the laundry, about forgetting to send it for pressing, dismissing it as a trivial loss in the chaos of Emily's disappearance. But now, as Miss Ashcroft traced the frayed edges of the ribbon found clutched in Harold Vernham's lifeless fist, she felt the puzzle pieces shift. 2 ribbons, 2 vanishings, one tail wound like thread through them both. The past had always lingered in Elmridge like a scent no wind could carry away, and it was quiet Clara, gentle unnoticed Clara, who stirred it awake. On a rainy afternoon thick with stillness, she had been scrubbing beneath the old armoire in the guest room, punishing herself with chores as a way to escape the weight of memory, when her cloth snagged on something firm yet foreign. Not splinter, not nail. With hands trembling in a way she couldn't explain, she pried the board loose, revealing a cavity tucked just beyond sight, shallow, deliberate, hidden with the kind of care only guilt affords. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth blackened by time and dust, was a small leather-bound book, its spine warped, its pages brittle with secrecy. Miss Ashcroft came at once. The diary was unmistakably Emily's, its looping script alive with longing and restlessness. The early entries spoke of summer picnics, of lilac blooms, of secret poems and orchard walls. But then came shadows, phrases smudged in panic. "He says I must wear the ribbon so he'll know it's me," one read, followed by "Mother knows. She watches from the stairs. She won't let me go. Not if I wear it." And then suddenly, the ink faltered, the page ended in a blot, as if the writer had been torn from her thoughts. The silence that followed was more chilling than any confession. But the real terror lay not just in what Emily feared, but what she carried. Between pages curled with time were careful notes. The scent of bergamot left in rooms after his visits, a gold cufflink engraved with initials she never dared to write, whispers of promises made in darkness. And one line, uneven, raw: "Before the will is changed we must act. It will all be ours if we're brave." Then later, "She can't know. Not yet. She'd take me away. Or worse, claim her for herself." Her? Miss Ashcroft reread that line 3 times. It wasn't just love or inheritance at stake, it was blood, a child, unnamed, unspoken of in town, but unmistakably present in the words, a disruption to everything the Derwents had fought to preserve. And perhaps, Miss Ashcroft considered, as thunder cracked above the rectory, it wasn't only Emily who vanished that night. In a village where names mattered more than truths, where records could be altered as easily as ribbons tied, the final thread came not in a memory but in a forgotten parish registry. A name, Honorine Darracott, struck through in thick black ink, replaced in unfamiliar handwriting with Mrs. Edward Fenmore, dated just after the disappearance. Miss Ashcroft closed the diary and exhaled slowly. This wasn't a tragedy born of passion. It was a lineage rethreaded, a life replaced, and the ribbon, a symbol not of love, but of identification, of possession, of silenced inheritance, had finally come full circle, not fluttering in the wind, but gripped in death's hand, demanding to be seen. The old Ashwood estate had stood untouched for years, its crumbling facade watching over the village like a blind sentinel, windows fogged with the passage of forgotten decades, the ivy-choked arches frozen in mid-climb, as if reaching for something never returned. The gardens, once tamed into neat perfection, had long since surrendered to wildness, brambles twisting over cracked pathways, the greenhouse shattered and hollow like a ribcage left to the elements. For a generation, no light had burned behind its tall windows, and none had dared ask why. But then, quite without warning, Eleanor Blackmore, now known as Mrs. Alton Reed, arrived under grey skies, dressed in widow's black and silence, her presence more a disturbance than a return. The villagers, always quick to remember what they claimed to have forgotten, began to whisper behind their drawn curtains. Eleanor hadn't just returned to her childhood home, she had reclaimed the very house from which her cousin Lillian had vanished on a storm-ridden night 24 years earlier, when thunder rolled like judgment and the orchard trees bent under the weight of wind and secrets. Back then, Lillian's disappearance had been gently swept aside by the family as the impetuous act of a headstrong girl, an elopement perhaps, or a youthful mistake, but the careful way the parish registry had been altered, Eleanor's own name inked out with bureaucratic precision, hinted that something deeper had festered beneath the Darlington respectability. And now Eleanor was back, walking those hollow halls as if summoned by something that had never truly left. The first stirrings of the past emerged not from gossip, but from dust and splinters, when Iris, the youngest housemaid, polishing the skirting beneath the attic stairs, felt her knuckles catch on a rusted hinge hidden in the floorboards. Beneath it, wrapped in fraying tartan cloth, was a tin box containing a child's gold locket etched with the Blackmore crest, and a brittle ledger scrap, its date stamped 6 months after Lillian vanished, with the chilling inscription, "Transferred to Miss E. Blackmore, care of H. Walcott, Calcutta." That single line unraveled everything. Miss Marlowe, once a school teacher, now a solitary figure in a cottage at the edge of the moor, remembered the name Walcott well. It had come up in whispers years ago, tied to shipping manifests and hastily signed papers. She said nothing, not yet, but her fingers hovered an inch longer than usual over the ledger's fading ink when she revisited the burial records. The days that followed bled with revelations. Behind the hearth in the blue parlor, a hairbrush was discovered, its handle engraved LB, and between its bristles strands of dark hair still clung like a whisper of someone who should not have vanished. In the fireplace's ashbin, a scorched photo surfaced, two girls in identical ribboned dresses, their faces consumed by fire, their matching shoes still visible at the bottom edge of the frame. Then, buried in the false bottom of Eleanor's traveling trunk, the laundress found a letter never posted, its edges singed, the words blurred but legible. He said once the girl was born, it would be ours, but the child has her mother's eyes, and she remembers. I cannot undo it now. I fear what must be done next. Suddenly, the question was no longer about what had happened to Lillian, but who had ensured it was never spoken of. At the parish records office, Miss Marlowe located a second name beneath Lillian's entry, Infant Blackmore, unmarked, but there had been no grave dug for the child, which meant the child had not died, but disappeared, spirited away and raised in secrecy, far from the Blackmore name. Now, as rumors spread like spilled ink, it was said the girl had returned, unknowingly walking the same lanes, her face unrecognized by blood, but familiar to truth. Was she the quiet florist's apprentice, who lingered too long at the headstones, or the young historian recently come to study the cemetery's lineage? Whomever she was, Eleanor knew, and her presence in the village was no homecoming. It was a containment. If the girl began to remember, if the past began to speak, everything would come undone. That evening, as the sun collapsed behind the ridge and shadows stretched long across the village green, Miss Marlowe found a violet ribbon tied neatly around her front door handle, not old, not tattered, but new and deliberate, the stitching immaculate, the scent a disturbing blend of lilac and faint smoke. It had not fluttered in the wind, nor been misplaced by chance. It had been placed with intent, with warning. She did not touch it at first, only stared, her heart held still beneath her ribs. This was not a prank. This was not coincidence. It was a mark, a silent message from someone who remembered what had been buried, and more chillingly, who knew that she had begun to remember as well. And in the private language of those who keep secrets too long, the ribbon spoke clearly. I know you're looking. And I'm watching. The past, once dormant, was now shifting in its shallow grave, and the ghost of Lillian Blackmore was not the only one stirring. It was never born out of ignorance. No, the silence was far too precise, too deliberately orchestrated. It was complicity in its most dignified disguise. Not a shield, but a burial shroud for a truth too incendiary to name aloud. Miss Eliza Wren had understood that the moment she read the faded ink on the back of the church registry, a date altered with care, initials smudged but not quite gone. The silence, she realized, had been inherited, passed from mother to daughter, from caretaker to conspirator, like an heirloom no one dared display. And now, decades later, it had cracked. It began quietly, as such storms often do. Marianne Greaves, simple and unsuspecting, returning from her errands as dusk fell like a velvet curtain, stepped through the back gate with her satchel, and was struck, not with the brutality of rage, but with the calculation of warning. The blow to her skull had been clean, controlled and chilling in its precision, meant to silence, not to spill blood. She had collapsed against the rose trellis, thorns piercing her sleeve, her breath shallow as her mind blurred. A child's laughter, distant and eerie, was the only sound in the foggy air, until the neighbor's terrier began to bark, and would not stop. The boy who found her said he smelled something strange, smoke and dried lavender, a scent that didn't belong to the garden. Miss Wren was summoned discreetly, not out of duty, but because the local constable, though well-meaning, lacked the eyes to see what time had hidden. She knelt beside the blood-stained trellis, and saw it a smear of ash along the fence, a broken brass button with the Barrington crest half erased, and a single blue thread clinging to the splintered wood. a color she had only ever seen in the christening gown locked inside the old manor trunk. The signs were subtle, but they screamed to her in the language of secrets. The next evening, she invited only 4 people, 4 too deeply entangled to deny involvement, and too weary to lie well anymore. The sitting room at Ivybank Cottage was arranged with meticulous calm, teacups of pale porcelain, sugar cubes placed evenly. And in the center, folded neatly beside the shortbread dish, was the green ribbon, once believed lost. Mrs. Holloway, stiff as ever, sat without a word, though her fingers tightened around her gloves when she saw it. The groundskeeper's widow, a woman whose voice hadn't been heard in years, trembled slightly as she looked at the ribbon, not with recognition, but fear. The pastor's son sat quietly, eyes flickering toward the hearth, where the fire burned lower than it should have. Marianne herself was pale, her hands clenched in her lap, as if holding something she hadn't dared say aloud. Miss Wren began, not with accusation, but with memory of the forgotten ledger found in the vicar's cellar, of the midwife who vanished weeks after a stillbirth was reported at Barrington House, of the estate's sealed records, and the second ribbon never returned. She spoke of the fire that destroyed the nursery wing, of the hidden diary with pages torn where names had once been, and of the girl, Eleanor, whose existence had been erased before it was ever confirmed. But she hadn't died. She had been taken, given another name, raised elsewhere, safely, but not by chance. Miss Wren turned to Marianne, not to accuse, but to reveal. "You were never who they said you were," she said gently, "and someone has waited a very long time to make sure you never find out." The room held its breath. Then she spoke of Peter Harrow, not a lover returned, but a vulture circling. He had been engaged to Eleanor once, not for love, but for legacy. When she disappeared, so too did his ambitions. And now, with whispers of the Barrington heir resurfacing, he had returned, not with roses, but with threats.
Oh.
The blow to Marianne's head was not meant to kill. It was meant to warn her to stay silent. But it was too late. The lies were bleeding through the seams. The teacup rattled slightly in its saucer as the wind outside shifted, as if the past itself stirred. Miss Wren's voice lowered to a near whisper. "Truth doesn't vanish," she said. "It waits, it watches, and when it returns, it demands reckoning." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hangs just before thunder, the kind that says something buried is clawing its way out. No one moved. Because now they all knew, the real question was no longer what had happened. It was who would kill again to keep it from being known. The moment demanded resolve, not sentiment, and when that moment came, Gabriel, hesitated, his charm crumbling like cheap porcelain beneath the weight of consequence.
He recoiled not from guilt,
but from exposure, from the looming specter of public ruin, and above all the threat of disinheritance that would sever him from the lineage he had been groomed to protect. He had promised escape, whispered it in candlelight, with trembling hands pressed to her stomach. But when the hour arrived, he chose the comfort of legacy over the chaos of love. He told her to wait, and in doing so, condemned her. Miss Eleanora Dane's voice never broke as she revealed this, yet every syllable carried the burden of decades buried. Her words laced with the melancholy weight of truths long left to rot in silence. Arabella's final journal entry, found sewn into the lining of a traveling coat, abandoned in a chest, bore signs of fear more than farewell. Fear of her mother's sharpened suspicions, of Gabriel's retreating warmth, and of a child whose presence could no longer be masked beneath corsets and cold compresses. Gabriel had vanished not in tragedy, but convenience, retreating into the continent under a false name, living a life built on the erasure of the one he had nearly shaped. And when he learned through a chain of whispers and half-legible letters that Amara existed, the daughter of the woman he'd forsaken, and that she stood unknowingly in line to inherit the lands he once coveted, he returned, not with remorse but with a purpose cloaked in civility. His arrival at the summer fete was not a reunion, it was surveillance. When he realized Lady Thorne had known all along, had shielded Amara in secret, had woven a web of careful misdirection to guard her from the sins of her origin, his calm unraveled. He confronted her beneath the elm tree by the lake, the very place Arabella had last been seen, and there, in hushed venom, demanded the truth be undone. But Lady Thorne did not yield. She had betrayed no one but her own silence, and she refused to let that sacrifice be for nothing. That, Miss Dane said quietly, was when the past reached forward, uninvited to demand its reckoning. Though she bore the Darrow name, Evelyn was not its echo but its reformation, an unassuming presence with eyes that held more wisdom than years, and a demeanor untouched by entitlement, as though the weight of legacy had passed over her like a storm sparing a single blossom. The confirmation of her lineage, once buried beneath layers of silence and strategic omission, arrived not with trumpets but with dusty documents, quietly unearthed from the back room of an old solicitor's archive, some of which had been discreetly arranged years prior by Miss Halbert, the long-retired housekeeper, whose loyalty had clearly been to the truth rather than the family's image. With the legalities swiftly resolved and the manor legally hers, Evelyn made no declarations of restoration nor murmured of aristocratic revival. Instead, she addressed the village council with calm clarity. The estate would no longer stand as a monument to faded nobility, but would serve as a sanctuary for the forgotten dreams of St. Aldwyn's children. Within a month, architectural plans transformed the crumbling West Wing into bright, airy classrooms. The frost-bitten conservatory, once shuttered and overrun with ivy, was designated a greenhouse for botanical lessons, and the drawing room where so many secrets had festered in velvet silence was stripped of its portraits and turned into a library lit by the laughter of learning. The nursery, still echoing faint lullabies of a generation lost to tragedy, was not sealed off in reverence but reopened, its walls painted fresh, its purpose reborn. The villagers did not applaud loudly, but their gestures spoke volumes. The baker offered bread for every school event, the blacksmith restored iron railings for free, and even old Mr. Penrose, who hadn't spoken to anyone since the flood of '89, showed up with a wheelbarrow full of saplings for the garden. Evelyn did not dwell on the past nor deny it. She acknowledged it silently, letting the house's new life speak where history had once held its breath. When Miss Halbert was quietly taken into custody on a late September morning, her coat buttoned to the chin, and her chin lifted not with defiance but with dignity, there was no scandal, no whisper of trial, only a small article tucked on page 4 of the local paper, referencing a private matter now closed. The townsfolk, ever attuned to the unsaid, neither speculated nor gossiped. Flowers arrived at her cell from unknown senders. The postmaster ensured her correspondence reached its destination. Even Constable Gray, a man known more for discipline than sentiment, removed his hat before escorting her into the station. Evelyn said little, but on the day the village school opened its doors beneath the crest of the Darrow family, newly engraved with the words, "From Legacy Light," a modest display appeared in the entrance hall, unlabeled and deliberately quiet. Behind the glass rested 3 objects: a silver locket tarnished with time, a letter sealed but never sent, and a tiny pair of shoes, long outgrown. Children passed it with curiosity, adults with memory, and somewhere within the stone walls that had once held only shadows, there bloomed a quiet kind of justice, not the kind rendered in courtrooms or headlines, but the kind that breathes through generations when a story ends not with punishment, but with understanding, and when a house once built on silence is reclaimed by the sound of hope. Beneath the dim hush of Greystone Hollow, where the mist clung like memory to cobbled paths and ivy strangled the bones of forgotten manors, the estate known as Blackmere House stood not in grandeur, but in guilt, its silence deeper than decay, its air weighted with secrets folded into its very floorboards. When Elara Vance, quiet-eyed and sharp-minded, unassuming in her modest wool skirts, was named the legal inheritor of the Blackmere legacy, it startled no one more than herself. The papers had emerged not from lawyers' drawers, but from an old gardener's trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and time, their ink faded but undeniable. The village solicitor confirmed it, hesitant but firm, and though Elara could have claimed it all, hallways of mahogany gloom, vaults of ledgers and locked drawers, She simply said she would open the West Wing to house a school for children long overlooked. No ribbon cuttings, no announcements, just instructions written in her own hand, clean and steady. But it wasn't the school that held the villagers' curiosity. It was the room she had left untouched. A narrow chamber tucked behind the drawing room, always locked, always cold. There were whispers, of course, of her aunt who had disappeared one autumn without trace, of a man named Corbin Hale, who once courted power with a smile too white to be pure, and of the midwife who had left Blackmere one storm-struck night and never returned. The truth, they suspected, lived somewhere in the creaking bones of that house, and Alara, though never confessing, seemed to understand it intimately. It was only much later, when the East Gardens bloomed unnaturally full in mid-October, and the house no longer creaked at night, that Miss Dalrymple, once a governess, now simply a woman who saw too much, paid her single visit. She brought nothing but a marbled notebook and a soft sprig of hawthorn. In the foyer now used as the school's reception stood a narrow glass case, unnoticed by most. Inside it lay a single child's glove, stitched of faded blue velvet, the hem torn, and beneath it, a placard engraved not with a name but a phrase, for the voice that was silenced, and the choice never given. No one asked whose glove it was. No one needed to. And though Alara never spoke of it, the room remained locked, not out of fear but out of respect. Justice in the end had not worn a badge or shouted in courtrooms, it had whispered in ink, in the trembling hand of a young woman who once chose silence to protect a child not her own. And the village, once wrapped in layers of polite unknowing, changed not in volume but in timbre. Conversations were no louder but truth seemed less buried. In the garden roses that had never bloomed now trembled awake, and Miss Dalrymple, seated by the sundial, quietly recorded the shifting air. For in the end it wasn't vengeance that haunted the house but love left unspoken. And some legacies she knew were not built on inheritance but on the courage to break the pattern. The glove, like the girl, remained unseen for years, but in the right hands even silence can blossom into truth. Even the faintest remnants, a half-torn photograph hidden behind an old mirror, a cryptic line in a forgotten letter, a garden gate left unlatched on a rainless night, can hum with the weight of a truth too long buried, waiting for the right soul to listen. The tale of Isadora Finch was never merely about a murder cloaked as an accident, it was about the fractures people cover with smiles, the secrets buried to keep others safe, and the cost of silence when it stretches across decades. Isadora wasn't the only one lost, so were the years spent believing a lie so gently told it felt like comfort. But when her niece Mara uncovered a strange pocket watch in the cellar, a timepiece stopped precisely at 4:17, its hands fused and a name scratched beneath the lid in a language she did not speak, everything shifted. Clues emerged not with drama but with subtle insistence, the discoloration of a curtain never opened, a ledger whose final entries had been erased and rewritten by a trembling hand, a cat that refused to pass the study door. And at the heart of it all stood Evelyn Hawthorne, the once trusted companion who had aged with grace but whose eyes betrayed sleepless nights. She had loved fiercely, yes, but fear had guided her hand in ways love never should. Now, dear listener, ask yourself if you knew a decision made in panic but rooted in devotion might spare a child the grief of truth but sentence another to a quiet undeserved ruin, would you choose the silence? Or would you speak, knowing it could unravel the world they thought they understood? Tell us what path you'd take, because it's your reflections that breathe new life into these mysteries. And if this story spoke to you, the layers beneath the whispers, the ache in choices made too late, the shadows that justice sometimes walks through, be sure to subscribe. These stories of hidden truths, unspoken bonds, and the haunting echo of what might have been will continue, and you'll want to be there when the next tale unfolds, perhaps in an attic, perhaps between the lines of an obituary, perhaps in a pressed flower never meant to be found. Until then, keep your curiosity burning, your instincts sharp, and remember, sometimes it's not a fingerprint or a confession that solves a mystery, but a moment, a pause, a breath, a question asked at the right time, that finally lets the truth speak.